Welcome to Creative Piecemeal Podcast, a podcast for creatives. I'm your host, Tammy Takeishi. Join me for compelling conversations with artists, actors, authors, musicians, and other creatives about the impact of the creative and fine arts in their lives and our ever-changing world. Thank you for listening. Hello, welcome to another episode of Creative Piecemeal. Today I'm joined by one of my favorite people, my former violin teacher, Ms. Eva Szekely. She is a soloist and chamber musician and has concertized extensively throughout North America, Europe, and South America, and appeared in such cities as Boston, Milwaukee, Chicago, Prague, New York, St. Louis, as well as on a concert series in France, Austria, and the Netherlands. And she is currently the University of Missouri's Middlebush Chair of Fine Arts and is the first violinist of the Esterhazy Quartet, as well as being the head of the string area at the University of Missouri School of Music. And she has a really long list of wonderful accomplishments that you can read, and I'll put that in the show notes. But I'm just really delighted to have her on the show.
Thank you very much for a lovely introduction.
Oh, you're welcome. So you, of course, play violin and have done so for a long time, but what led you to become a musician?
Well, that's an actually fairly easy question. I grew up as the daughter of a musician in the symphony orchestra, and so being backstage both for symphony rehearsals and for opera rehearsals was something that was the most natural thing for me. It was home. And I don't know that I actually actively chose to become a musician. It kind of just seemed to evolve in that direction. I think the real decision came much, much later.
Mm-hmm. How did you end up deciding on violin as opposed to other instruments?
I did not actually. I received the violin as a gift as a Christmas gift when I was, I think, about 6 years old. I studied piano for a short time after I started playing the violin, but the violin was going to be it. My father was a violinist and violist. And so I guess maybe my parents decided it was going to be the violin. And I think that's okay. I never had any kind of argument with their choice.
And it worked out all right.
Yeah, it did.
What was it like growing up in a musical family? Obviously full of lots of music playing.
Yes, lots of practicing that my father was doing at home. And he also had friends that he regularly played string quartets with at home. So, there's all kinds of stories about me sitting on my little baby chair right in the middle of everything and just listening. So to me, that seemed like perfectly average, normal, everyday thing. It was not anything that stood out.
It must have created some wonderful memories, though, once you got started playing an instrument and being able to play with them.
I did eventually. I think once about halfway through elementary school, I started to do some reading, with them. Sometimes somebody would kind of make room for me to play. And again, the whole environment was such normalcy about it. I didn't really realize until much later that this was something that was not every day, that everybody did not have the same experience. I did not know that. Certainly not as a young child.
I understand that, coming from a musical family myself. We sing holiday carols and play music together in the evenings when I was younger. And I realized also that was not normal, not the everyday.
Absolutely. And to this day, when I have students who I am privileged to teach, who, for example, were exposed to music only in their school and they did not have any kind of experience before then, that always leaves me with a great impression of how lucky it was in my case, for example, that I was basically born into it, and how easy to a certain extent, that was an easy way in rather than having to struggle to find what really meant a lot to you.
You grew up to become a professional musician and you went to Juilliard. Do you have any fun or meaningful memories from your college days?
Oh, lots of them. Many wonderful memories. Some of them are standout performances, for example. Some of them are kind of surprising memories, like my very first, for example, the very first orchestra concert at Juilliard that I played in. The main work on the program was the Bartók Concerto for Orchestra, and I never even knew it existed. So kind of an entry into portion of 20th century music, which was completely foreign to me, even though, as you know, my family and I came from Eastern Europe, so that music should not have been foreign. But at the time, behind the Iron Curtain, we really did not have much exposure to any music of the 20th century unless they were Soviet composers or contemporary composers of the communist countries surrounding us.
That must have made for a rather unusual and sort of unique musical experience growing up. So you just sort of had a select group of music that you were used to then.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right about that. And I was 16 years old when we came to the United States, we left Romania, really, maybe that's a better way to put it. And in that moment, for me, those were the 60s. Can you imagine? Debussy and Prokofiev seemed like new music. That's what seemed to be kind of at the edge of the repertory that I was familiar with. So anything that came after that was unfamiliar.
So you were able to sort of hear it with fresh ears when you came to America and when you went to school then?
Yes, that's putting it very accurately. That's exactly right. It was all new.
But I think even people today, going to music school, even without those specific parameters, people may not be exposed to certain music just because maybe their family likes a different kind of music, or maybe they just don't click on the radio and listen to classical, for example.
Exactly. So it's in some ways there is a parallel there. Mm-hmm. More about the period of music rather than the style of it, but still the same. And the other part of it that was really a wonderful surprise, and it was certainly a great memory, is that I had occasion to hear some extraordinary jazz musicians while I was in school. I had a theory professor who was a jazz pianist, and he brought people like Miles Davis, for example, to our theory class, or and many others. And that was entirely new experience as well. Not to mention the fact that all of those gentlemen and my theory professor included were smoking like chimneys. So that the room was absolutely a cloud of gray, but the music making was fabulous, and that was new. That exposure was also new.
What was it like to move to the Big Apple after coming from Eastern Europe?
Well, that's a very good question. It really wasn't so much about the Big Apple as it was the United States more than anything. I grew up in a city, not the size of New York, obviously, but certainly close to over 500,000 population. And I also spent some time in the capital of Bucharest, where that was almost twice as large as that. So it wasn't really much about that. It was about the fact that there was a sense of, I guess the best word to use, a sense of freedom about being able to go anywhere and do anything that you wanted to do without being concerned about particular negative consequences to it. You could also say what you wanted. You could light your candles if you happen to be observing a certain religion and didn't have to pull the shades down. And I remember my parents and I being so very wonderfully surprised that we saw menorahs and Hanukkah candles in people's windows and apartment buildings. We had never experienced that before. There was always something to hide rather something to actually celebrate. And so those kinds of things made the biggest difference.
Yeah, I can imagine. I'm so glad that you were able to immigrate to America and bring your gifts of music and of teaching.
My father was also, in addition to being a symphony player, he was a very successful teacher. So I watched him and occasionally helped by the time I was very early teens to practice with some of his students, or at least play along with them. So that was also an activity that seemed the most natural thing to do. So I didn't do any babysitting, for example, as an 11 or 12-year-old, but I was basically babysitting 7 and 8-year-olds with their violin and playing with them and fixing a few things and listening. So all of that was kind of a package experience.
And you're a fantastic teacher, and you've dispensed a lot of musical advice over the years, but is there one golden nugget of advice that you'd give to musicians?
Listen to as much music as you possibly can, and do not discount your own tastes. And what I always try to explain, that it doesn't matter if you listen to something that you don't like. It's experiencing that and listening critically and making that decision is every bit as valid as listening to something that you fall in love with and you can't wait to start to learn or play or study. Just keeping constantly developing the critical ear, regardless of the personal opinion about it. It's okay not to like something, and it's okay to listen to a performance of something and say, I don't like this, or maybe I like that. So somebody is playing a piece and you like parts of it but not other parts. The fact that you recognize that is already a big step up in your critical development.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Having an open mind and open ears really helps to develop a musician's ability to play of any genre.
Yeah, I mean, what I would add to that is precisely what you were just mentioning, is that I make a point of sending my students, almost demanding these days, maybe more than I used to, Tammy, that they go and listen to music written for instruments other than their own. And that includes voice, and it includes winds, it includes the different styles. It could be jazz, it could be anything at all. And recognizing, again, developing the critical ear to recognize what they consider to be quality, and not only of the music making itself, but also of the works being played. So if you want to play a string quartet by Shostakovich, you absolutely must know what is in the opera, or what is in the symphonies, or what is in the piano music, to understand the language of that composer in different mediums, not just necessarily the one for your own instrument.
Definitely. I remember when you were teaching me one of the Haydn violin concertos, and I was like, oh, there's this bit and it sounds just like the Haydn cello concerto, one of them.
Exactly. Understanding and recognizing the individual language of each composer, you have to know the breadth of the work of that composer, and not just limited to your own instrument. That's extremely important.
There's so much beautiful music out there in the world to play and to listen to, but is there anything or any composer that you gravitate toward more than others?
Without thinking, if I just say the first thing that comes to mind, it would have to be Mozart. Not the only one, but that would be my first go-to. When I moved away from my parents' home and I had my first apartment, my first two records that I bought for myself were the Mozart Requiem and the Mahler First Symphony. And I listened to those two things for a long, long time until I could afford to buy some more recordings. But those were the first two. One of the reasons were the performers that were involved there, but also the works themselves.
They are excellent.
You probably remember this, but I am kind of an opera buff.
Mhm.
So when it comes to Mozart, there is hardly anything that is more exciting and more wonderful and pretty much perfect in writing for opera than the Mozart works, every single one of them. And if you don't understand the operatic language of Mozart, maintain that you do not understand the music.
Yeah, Mozart's fantastic. Definitely one of my personal favorites as well.
Only once in my entire career so far did I come up against a student in my very early days, not here, but in another state, who I started to work with, a young lady who was a freshman. And we were making a plan for the semester, gave her the music that we're going to plan to work on, both the technique and the repertoire. And then she said, I'm sorry, I don't do Mozart. I can't stand that music. And that was our first lesson. And it was also the only time in my whole life when it was also the last one. Because I basically told her that I cannot relate to that. And therefore, I don't think we are a good match to work together.
Yeah, I didn't think anybody didn't like Mozart.
It was much stronger than not liking. And I just felt a resistance there that I said, Mozart does not need me to defend him, so I am not going to get engaged in that conversation.
Yes. Smart move.
I'd never, ever had to do that again, and I felt awful afterwards, but I still think it was the right thing to do. It would never have worked out.
Yes, yeah. A student-teacher relationship is definitely one where it has to click on both sides, for sure.
Yeah, and that was, one wall too high for me to try to tackle. I could not, at least at that point, I was in my late 20s. Maybe I would try but I would be more challenged by that today. But at that moment, nope, not doing that.
Yes. So you've garnered many musical accomplishments, including, traveling the world and having pieces written for you and your quartet. But what is one non-musical accomplishment that you're really proud of?
Well, I got to tell you, one of my most satisfying, proudest moments was the day that I became an American citizen. And that was decidedly non-musical, even though I happened to be in concert clothes because I was in school, and we came with a friend of mine directly from a concert. So we were all dressed in black, but that was a very special day and a moment of great significance.
I can imagine. I don't think there's too many accomplishments that would top that for you.
Well, I mean, I don't know to what extent it's an accomplishment, but it was an event, that we waited 5 years to be able to get to that point, and had to be very careful during those 5 years not to make any missteps. So from that standpoint, it was a very big thing. And I was sworn in as an American citizen a few months after my parents, even though we arrived together into the country. But I had spent quite a bit of time during my school years out of the country, in Italy and in France. And so all the times that you were outside the United States of those 5 years, they would deduct. So it took a few months longer, 5 years and a little bit longer, so that I got to go and do that on my own rather than the three of us as a family.
And speaking of accomplishments in general, what is one of your favorite teaching memories?
Well, I would say that every time I have a student who really excels, either in competition or in occupying a position that they auditioned for, that is always a very important moment. I had a student who placed second in a national competition in the United States. That was definitely a memorable moment. It's the success of those students who really are at the highest levels, but not necessarily only. There are a number of memories that I have about students who have become outstanding professionals in education, and great successes in what they chose to do with their musical education. And I don't mind saying, Tammy, that you're one of those examples.
Oh, thank
You
you.
know, you found your way. You worked as hard as anybody that I know, and you found exactly the right thing for you and how to function within the musical profession and to contribute the most that you can. For a teacher, that's basically everything.
Mm. I definitely have so many fond memories, and I still teach to this day. I teach every weekend, little piano players and little violin players, and I still pull out gems from my days and with you. So
Well, there you see. So it's not only just your profession as a certified music therapist, but even in addition to that, still keeping the pedagogical side of your activity going. Yeah, well, those are the big success stories. And right now, I think we need teachers in the arts more than ever.
very true. And speaking of teaching, is there a piece of teaching advice that you would impart on young music teachers?
Patience, kindness, and consistency in demanding the best. To be absolutely consistent so that a student understands what they're expected to do, but always with patience and kindness. Every student learns in a different way. They have a different way of absorbing information, and that is kind of a journey of discovery early on, which I think is always very exciting and to a certain degree part of the most creative part of teaching. And then once there is an understanding of how this student will best learn, then to be consistent about the way that the information is passed on.
I would 100% agree. Yeah.
As adults, we already know that all of us have better days and not so good days. And that is not limited to adults. It's also limited to young people. And they're allowed an off day without making them feel badly about it.
Especially those little ones. When they have an off day, it's very clear.
It's very clear. And then the idea is to try to make the experience as positive as you possibly can, to try to turn around that off day a little bit. And maybe they will leave a little bit more smiling and a little happier than they came in. And that's the best thing that one can do.
What is a common stereotype about being a musician and a performer and educator that you hope to break with your work, with your teaching?
I think maybe what I would like, or what I hope that I continue to develop, is the philosophy that we learn from the past, but we don't have to stick with it. Mm-hmm. So that there is always innovation on the horizon. And that is not really discounting what came before, but not going back and doing things the same way that it was done 50 years ago or 60 years ago, because we have come a long way from there. And I think I run into young people still who have training that shows that they were working with individuals who had not really kept up to date as much as necessary, whether it's a matter of methodology, whether it's a matter of additions, whether it's a matter of precisely the psychology of teaching. We know a lot more about that than when I was growing up. Already in my generation, I remember my father saying that he understood by the time he started teaching, and with and his experience with helping me, what the mistakes were that his teachers had made, and I think that was kind of the example for me to see that you have to keep up and keep moving and trying to adapt to the developments that will come, whether you like it or not. Things do change. And of course, today, the requirements of the music that is being written today need different approaches. You cannot approach it the way that you might have done it in the 1920s, because the music requires entirely different skills and different attitude.
Definitely. Very well said. Very well said. That's one of the beautiful things I think about the creative arts, is that you never stop being a student. In some ways, you're always learning.
Absolutely. And I think that's If there is such a thing as staying young, I think to a certain extent that keeps all of us much more active and much more youthful, because there is routine to it, but only if you let it be. There is a certain routine. There is a routine to organizing your practice time and doing all kinds of things, but there should never be a routine to thinking.
You touched briefly on the creative process earlier, but do you have a favorite part and a least favorite part of the creative process?
I love studying scores. I find that always very exciting and very informative and just adventurous, if you will. I am a person who doesn't particularly love to practice, but I have to. So it's not that I get up every morning and can't wait to go practice. I do that because it's part of my work, but I'm not very excited about that. Certainly not as excited about it as the routine part of it, as I am about opening a score I haven't seen before and starting to discover things. That discovery in the creative process is something that I absolutely adore. And the price of having that adventure, if you will, to have being able to do that, is that you then have to learn what you discovered.
Yes, I definitely can understand, especially in my younger years, practicing was not something I enjoyed. I definitely went through a phase.
Well, I mean, people go to work in an office every single day, 9 to 5 or whatever their schedule might be. And there are, I'm sure, parts of that schedule that gets less than exciting after a while.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But you have to do it because that's part of the job.
Yeah.
I've never really thought of my job as the reason for doing my job is not to make a living. The reason to do my job is because I'd rather do that than anything else. And so there are parts of that work that maybe are not my favorite thing. I do it anyway, obviously, or you cannot get to the next step.
Yes, yes. Obviously, there's lots of rewarding parts, like being able to tour and play wonderful music and teach the next generation.
There obviously, and and the traveling and getting to meet new people and new places. I often get some of my family members who nobody in my family is in my generation is a musician whatsoever, and so they always ask me, what my vacation plans are. And my vacation plans, when I ask them, they're going on a cruise or they're traveling across the Atlantic or going out to the West Coast. Well, I get to do all of that as part of my work. So when it's time for a vacation, very often I kind of tease them a little bit and say, well, I'm going to stay home for my vacation. Of course, all of that is pre-pandemic, right? We stayed home long enough during the pandemic, heaven forbid. So
we're going to switch gears here. And I was wondering, do you have any favorite books, whether it's musical or non-musical, that you find inspiring and entertaining?
My goodness, there would be a long list of those. I tend to read more biographical things than fiction, although I do read some fiction, but very often very much interested in biographies and stories about people who have musical connections, whether it's from the 19th century or the 18th century, poets and writers who inspired. And of course, you would have to start with Shakespeare at that point. Mm-hmm. But I love to read the poetry of Heine, for example, German poet who Schubert and Schumann used text of theirs a great deal. But if we're looking at non-musical things, I think the big novels that I fairly often reread would be, for example, War and Peace of Tolstoy. I always find that fascinating. Every time that I read it, I seem to find something else that I had not noticed before. Of course, somebody like Thomas Mann, Death in Venice is one of the books that I absolutely love to read, in part, again, because of its musical influence. And then there are the American literary works that I didn't really get to know until I was in college, for the most part. Not entirely, but for the most part. For example, John Steinbeck, I didn't get to read until I was in college. Not true of Mark Twain, because those, Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer and all of that appeared in translations, so I got to read those not in English. But then reading them in English made it a very different type of experience. Reading Huckleberry Finn, for example, in original language, with the dialect that is in there, was something that translations cannot really represent. And so the story was familiar, but the nuances were entirely different. And of course, we mentioned Shakespeare. You cannot possibly not mention something like Dante, the La Commedia Divina, the Divine Comedy. I mean, that speaks to the human condition in ways that very few works in literature do. And what is remarkable about that, and I do return to it, maybe not the entire thing in one sitting, but sections of it, is remarkable to me because we're talking about the 13th century. And the relevance of that to the 21st century is really astonishing. Where we are in the progress of humanity and where we are in the foundation of the human condition are two different things. And I find that fascinating. We've been to the moon, we're flying every which way, we're living with a little box that we use as a phone and all of that. But then you go back and you read a section of Paradise in the Divine Comedy and you go, wait, what? This could have been yesterday.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely fascinating to me.
You mentioned earlier that you're an opera buff. Are there any operas that you haven't seen that you want to see?
Those would be the operas that I have not seen, that are, for the most part, American works or British works that have been produced in the last 20 years. I have not seen all of those. Up to Benjamin Britten, I think I've pretty much seen about most of what there is. Certainly the general repertory I have seen productions of since I was a kid. So that was, again, something that was a completely unexpected new experience for me when in my first year at Juilliard, I got to know friends who had never seen an opera production. And to me, that was like, what? I mean, I grew up with in between the sets and backstage and the lights and all of that. As a child, my parents had a pretty hard time with me because I didn't like sad stories. Even as a baby, even puppet theater where somebody was about to get hurt or fall down or something, I always had to leave. And so every time that they, for example, had a production of Tosca where she jumps out from the castle, I would be in the theater up to that point, but I knew exactly when that was going to happen, and I would just leave. And that was true of Aida and all of those big tragedies. I knew them well enough to leave just in time before the sad part comes. But I enjoyed the Rossini operas because those were always comedies. And for the most part, the Mozart operas also, not all of them, but many of them. And I guess if I could have chosen, or I would have been fortunate enough to have a voice that would have been an operatic voice or could have developed into an operatic voice, that would have been my dream, to be an opera singer. Alas, vocal cords did not really collaborate with that, but I absolutely adore listening to singers. And I think we can learn as instrumentalists. After all, the voice is the perfect instrument. And we can learn a great deal from the coloring and the phrasing and the lines in vocal lines. I tried to, when I was in elementary school, I wanted to sing in a choir. At school, elementary school choir, you know what happened? The teacher who listened to all the children one after the other sing some kind of a little ditty, they asked me to bring my violin instead. Oh. So there's somewhere there is a picture of these kids in the second or third grade all standing on risers, and there is one with the violin right in front. So singing was not something that was part of my gifts, putting it mildly. I could hear everything, but the vocal cords were not collaborating. I do love opera, and I could listen to certain things forever. It's not that I don't like symphonic orchestral music, because I do, but I could listen to Rossini's Barber of Seville 1,000 times and not be tired of it. I don't know that I could listen to Schumann or Dvorak symphony 1,000 times and not be tired of it, or the Berlioz or whatever it might be. I've never really quite expressed it in that way, but I think it's true. I find the job of the task of carrying a vocal line and everything else that goes with it, the diction, the staging, the memorization of all of that, then the greatest artists with their shading. Maria Callas is forever going to be an idol of mine. You listen to the way that she was hearing music in her recordings, and I think it's practically unattainable by anybody else. I mean, it remains the standard, and I don't know when or if anybody is going to have to be able to do more than that. She manages to find colors that anticipate orchestral sounds, like in certain areas, she will start in a color that blends in with an English horn or an oboe, and you kind of say, "Wait, is she singing, or is that or is that the oboe, or is that the bassoon or the clarinet or whatever it might be?" She did things that nobody else ever even tried, let alone accomplished.
It definitely creates some really beautiful and almost transcendental musical moments as a listener.
Absolutely, yes. And then we haven't even mentioned the fact that she was one of the first operatic stars that actually put a lot of weight into the acting of the part. Because up to that point, there were lots of singers with wonderful voices, fantastically developed and trained and gorgeous sound, but they would stand at the edge of the stage, and they would stand there and basically deliver the aria. What she added to that was acting the part, not only singing the text, but actually acting it. And she sought out advice on that and direction on that, and was able to achieve again, I already said that. So far, it is without a doubt the standard that very few people can get close to. A lot of people try, and they're outstanding. And then there is still this much left. Brilliant, beautiful, accomplished, gorgeous, and then there is that still.
Yeah, she really had a high bar for opera, for sure.
She had a high bar, which she set for herself. You know, I think the remarkable thing about that is that she was not modeling herself on somebody. She was inspired, by lots of great singers, as I mentioned. But she took things to a different level in her own understanding of studying the score, and her own understanding of how to create character along with delivering the music.
And that goes really well into your point of how we as musicians, especially students, should listen to all different recordings and genres and study the scores of our music too, so that we can elevate the art and elevate ourselves as performers.
Absolutely. And I said that nobody has really come close in the opera world. Well, there is somebody who I will mention now that I think was moving along the same lines and may have in his own way come close. And you may be surprised that I would mention somebody like Frank Sinatra. If you listen to Sinatra, you will notice one thing that I certainly noticed. And I think if you point it out to if I point it out to you, you might actually notice it yourself. You can understand and follow every single syllable he sings. There is never a word that is unclear. And that is in many ways absolutely unique to Sinatra. And he was very much a perfectionist in the sense of his supporting musicians that were working with him. And he brought that style of music making maybe to the higher level than most everybody else in his world.
Now that you mention it, I can totally see that. He just has a certain eloquence. He, like you said, he's got that diction, but then he's got that character and spirit in his voice.
He sings the story.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what I was trying to say about Maria Callas. Again, entirely different situation, different style, different genre, but he does sing the story, and you get every single word of it, every single syllable, every single coloration of it.
Yeah, there's not too many people that really do that nowadays. There's people that emulate it, but there's not really going to be another Frankie,
In my opinion, no. Again, the direction is different, but if you look at his contemporaries and the people that were in his world, generation behind or generation ahead or the same generation, he stands out. Not that other performers were not exciting in their own way, and everybody brought their own contribution, but that was something special.
Would you say he and Maria Callas are some people that you would have loved to meet?
Oh yeah, Sinatra would scare the heck out of me because he's New Jersey is where he came from, and I have family, and my mother, of course, who lives in the area where his mother used to live. That was a kind of a scary area in the 30s and 40s, mafia connections and all of that. But I would like to have a conversation with Sinatra. I don't know that I would pick him out specifically. Callas, definitely. I think I would, if I had to choose somebody I would love to have a chance to meet and have a conversation with, it would be one of the great conductors. It would be somebody like Carlos Kleiber, for example. That person is absolutely fascinating individual. I saw a couple of performances of his at the Met. He didn't do very much in New York. Certainly one of the greatest conductors of the 20th century. And he had insight into scores that is beyond most musicians of his the second half of the 20th century. Leonard Bernstein went and told his musicians in the New York Philharmonic that if you want to hear the greatest conductor in the world, go across the street and watch Kleiber conduct the Strauss's Rosenkavalier at the Met. Everybody was in awe of what he was able to bring out of a score. So those would be the two people. Carlos Kleiber and Maria Callas. There you go.
That would be a good group to have coffee with.
Oh my goodness, maybe the two of them together, although I don't think they ever met. That would be something. Well, at least people of the 20th century. Then I don't know what I would choose from previous centuries. Would be something different.
So one final question, and that is, in your own words, what does it mean to live a creative life?
Wow. That's a big question, Tammy. The number one word that would come to mind would be freedom. And part of that freedom, of course, includes discipline and self-motivation, but the freedom to do and to make choices and to make decisions that are individual. I think freedom from that standpoint. To have the ability to create or to construct a piece of work or a piece of music in whichever direction you feel that you want it to go, and to have the freedom to do that. And that freedom comes with the responsibility of discipline and knowledge. So I think sometimes the attitude of non-musicians or non-creative artists in any genre is that somehow these creative qualities that somebody might have in any of the arts is some kind of a gift that kind of falls out of the sky, and that you ride it along and get through life somehow much more easily than other professions. And I think that is definitely a huge misunderstanding.
I've never really thought of it that way about it being a sense of freedom, but it completely makes sense because with creativity, you sort of have no limits to what you can do.
Absolutely, that freedom in that sense, that there is no limit, but there is discipline and decision making, and so you basically create your own parameters, but you have the freedom to go in whichever direction the individual wishes to go. In some ways, that also means that you do not have a boss. You know, for the layman, that's basically what that means.
Yeah. Being your own boss, though, is sometimes a good thing and a bad thing.
Well, yes, but that's where the discipline part comes in. Exactly, you know. And so somebody is not going to necessarily tell you how to do something, but they're expecting you to get it done. Something along those lines.
Well, Ms. Szekely, thank you so much for being on the show. Is there anything else you'd like to impart with our listeners before we sign off?
Think that your questions were really very well thought out, and you touched on many, many things. This was fun. It was my first outing on a podcast. Never done it before. So now I can say, there you go, experience, check mark.
There you go.
Right. I have listened to some of your interviews before, and they're always excellent. So it was really fun. Great to see you, and a pleasure to at least try to answer the questions that you posed as well as I could.
Oh, you did fantastic. And listeners, please check the show notes to learn more about the program at the University of Missouri, Columbia, and Professor Szekely and the Esterházy Quartet. And as always, thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Like the show? Have a question? Stop by the Facebook and Instagram pages. Links are in the show notes, or search for Creative Piecemeal Podcast on social media and click follow for all the latest.